November 1934. A mother in New York City opens her mail and finds a letter that will destroy her world. It's from a man who claims to have killed and eaten her daughter 6 years earlier. But this isn't just a confession. It's a detailed, sadistic description of every horrific moment. The letter is signed by someone calling himself Mr. Howard, but police would soon learn his real name, Albert Fish, and this letter wasn't the end of his cruelty. It was his masterpiece. Intent. It separates the desperate from the deliberate, the broken from the purely evil. Some killers are driven by rage, others by greed. But what about those who kill for the simple pleasure of causing pain? What do we call someone whose intent isn't just murder, but the complete psychological destruction of everyone left behind? Today on Deadly Intent, we're exploring one of the most disturbing cases in criminal history, not just because of what Albert Fish did to his victims, but because of how he weaponized their family's grief. This is the story of a man who didn't just want to be a killer. He wanted to become the literal boogeyman that parents warned their children about, and for decades, he succeeded. I'm Carmen Carrion, and if you've been following Deadly Intent, you know we don't just examine what killers do. We explore why they do it, because understanding intent isn't just about solving crimes. It's about confronting the darkest possibilities of human nature. This isn't an unsolved mystery. Albert Fish was caught, tried, and executed. We know exactly what he did and how he did it. But the question that haunts psychologists and criminologists nearly a century later is why? Why did Albert Fish need his victims' families to know exactly how their loved ones suffered? Why did he take such elaborate steps to maximize psychological torture? And most disturbing of all, why did he seem to believe that becoming everyone's worst nightmare was somehow his destiny? This case happened during the Great Depression, when families were already struggling just to survive. But Albert Fish brought a different kind of darkness into their lives, one that couldn't be fixed with jobs or food or hope. He brought the kind of evil that makes parents afraid to let their children out of sight. The kind that turns bedtime stories into warnings about monsters. Except this monster was real, and his intent was far more calculated than any creature from folklore. So I need to warn you up front. This episode contains discussions of violence against children and psychological torture that some listeners may find extremely disturbing. Sometimes, confronting real evil helps us understand how to recognize and stop it. Because Albert Fish wasn't born a monster. He became one, step by step, choice by choice. And understanding that transformation might be the key to preventing the next boogeyman from taking his place. May 19th, 1870, Washington, D.C. Hamilton Howard Fish was born into a world that seemed designed to break children. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 years old when Albert was born, ancient by the standards of the era. His mother, Ellen, was 32 and already overwhelmed by poverty and mental illness that ran through both sides of the family. But it wasn't just genetics that would shape Albert Fish into something unspeakable. It was a series of choices, his own and others, that would systematically destroy any capacity for normal human empathy he might have possessed. When Albert was 5 years old, his father died, leaving the family destitute. Ellen Fish couldn't care for her children alone, so she made a decision that would haunt Albert for the rest of his life. She placed him in St. John's Orphanage, a Washington, D.C. institution that was notorious for its brutal treatment of children. At St. John's, Albert experienced systematic abuse that would have destroyed most children's ability to trust or love. But Albert Fish didn't break in the way other children broke. Instead, He adapted. He learned to survive by becoming something else entirely. The boys at St. John's were beaten regularly, not just as punishment, but as a matter of routine discipline. Albert later claimed that he was stripped naked and whipped so frequently that he began to associate pain with pleasure. Whether this was true or a later fabrication designed to gain sympathy, it established a pattern that would define his entire life. Albert Fish learned to find satisfaction in suffering. But more disturbing than the abuse he suffered was his reaction to it. Other children cowered, cried, tried to avoid punishment. Albert began to anticipate it. He started misbehaving deliberately, not in rebellion, but because he craved the pain that would follow. Most abused children either shut down emotionally or act out in ways that cry for help. But Albert Fish's response was different. He wasn't seeking rescue. He was seeking more abuse. And that's the first warning sign that we're dealing with someone whose psychology was fundamentally different from other victims of childhood trauma. When Albert was 7, his mother retrieved him from St. John's, but the damage was already done. The boy who came home wasn't the same child she had sent away. He was quieter, stranger, and prone to behaviors that deeply disturbed his family. Albert began exhibiting signs of what we would now recognize as severe psychological disturbance. He was caught multiple times engaging in self-harm, using needles to pierce his own skin. When asked why, he couldn't explain. He just said it felt good. He also began showing unusual interest in pain and violence. Neighbors later recalled finding young Albert torturing small animals, not in the casual cruelty sometimes displayed by children, but with systematic, deliberate methods that suggested he was studying how to cause maximum suffering. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Albert began to develop elaborate fantasies about pain and punishment. He would tell other children detailed stories about torture methods, cannibalism, and human sacrifice. These weren't the normal, morbid curiosity of childhood. They were detailed, sophisticated scenarios that suggested Albert was spending considerable time thinking about how to hurt people. By the time Albert Fish reached adolescence, 3 key elements of his future crimes were already established: an association of pain with pleasure, a fascination with detailed cruelty, and most importantly, a need to share his dark fantasies with others. He wasn't content to keep his twisted thoughts to himself. Even as a child, Albert Fish wanted other people to know exactly what he was thinking about doing to them. Let's pause here and examine what we're seeing in Albert Fish's early development. Most children who experience severe abuse either develop trauma responses designed to protect themselves, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, avoidance behaviors, or they act out in ways that communicate their distress to potential rescuers. But Albert Fish's response was different. Instead of seeking protection or rescue, he began actively seeking more opportunities for pain and violence. This suggests that something in his psychological makeup was fundamentally different from other abuse victims. Research in forensic psychology has identified patterns like Fish's as potential early indicators of what's called sadistic personality disorder, a condition where individuals derive pleasure not just from their own pain, but from the pain of others. But Albert Fish's case was unusual even by those standards. Most sadistic individuals are content to inflict pain directly. They want to see their victims suffer in person. But Albert Fish developed what researchers have termed secondary sadism, deriving pleasure not just from inflicting pain, but from describing it, from knowing that others are imagining or experiencing that pain through his words. This explains his elaborate childhood fantasies and his need to share them with others. He wasn't just imagining violence, he was discovering that words themselves could be weapons, that talking about violence could be almost as satisfying as committing it. This distinction is crucial for understanding Albert Fish's later crimes. His intent wasn't just to kill or even just to torture. His intent was to create stories, detailed, horrific narratives that would live in other people's minds long after his victims were dead. He was already learning as a child how to weaponize imagination itself, how to turn words into instruments of torture that could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. By the time Albert Fish became an adult, he had essentially developed two methods of causing pain: physical violence against his direct victims and psychological violence against everyone else who would hear about what he had done. And unlike most killers who try to hide their crimes, Albert Fish would spend his entire adult life perfecting ways to make sure as many people as possible knew exactly what he was capable of. 1890, at the age of 20, Albert Fish moved to New York City and began working as a house painter. To his neighbors and co-workers, he seemed like an unremarkable man, quiet, religious, devoted to his family when he eventually married and had children. But Albert Fish had learned to wear normalcy like a mask, hiding his true nature behind a facade of respectability. His first marriage to Anna Mary Hoffman in 1898 produced 6 children. By all accounts, Fish was a devoted father, at least on the surface. His children later described him as strict but caring, religious to the point of obsession, but never physically abusive toward them. But Albert Fish was living a double life. During the day, he painted houses and raised his family. At night, he began exploring the darker corners of human behavior. Fish started frequenting brothels in New York's red light districts, but not for conventional purposes. He was seeking out sex workers who catered to unusual requests, specifically those willing to inflict pain. He began paying women to beat him, to stick him with pins and needles, to burn him with candles and hot wax. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy Fish's growing appetite for suffering. He began experimenting with self-torture, inserting needles into his own body in sensitive areas, sometimes leaving them there for weeks at a time. X-rays taken after his eventual arrest would reveal dozens of needles embedded throughout his body. Reading about Fish's self-torture, I'm struck by the systematic nature of it. This wasn't impulsive self-harm. It was calculated, methodical, almost scientific. He was conducting experiments on his own capacity for pain, pushing boundaries, testing limits, and all the while, he was developing an increasingly elaborate internal fantasy life. Fish would later claim that he heard voices, religious voices, commanding him to commit acts of violence. Whether these voices were real hallucinations or convenient excuses, they provided Fish with a framework for the crimes he was already planning to commit. In 1917, Fish's wife left him for another man, taking their children with her. For most people, this kind of abandonment would be devastating. For Albert Fish, it was liberation. Without a family to maintain his mask of normalcy for, Fish began acting on impulses he had suppressed for decades. He started traveling throughout the northeastern United States, taking painting jobs that would give him access to families and children. And he began writing letters. Fish's letters from this period reveal the evolution of his intent from fantasy to action. He would identify families through newspaper advertisements or casual conversations, then send them anonymous letters describing in graphic detail what he wanted to do to their children. Most recipients threw these letters away in disgust, assuming they were products of a disturbed mind, but not taking them seriously as actual threats. This was exactly what Fish wanted. He was discovering that he could terrorize people without consequences, that he could inject his violent fantasies directly into their homes and minds. But for Albert Fish, psychological torture was just the beginning. He was preparing for something much worse. Before we continue with Fish's crimes, it's important to understand the world he was operating in. The 1920s were a period of massive social change in America. Cities were growing rapidly, filled with immigrants and rural families seeking opportunity during and after World War I. Law enforcement was fragmented. There was no FBI database, no centralized criminal records, no way to track someone moving between jurisdictions. A predator could literally reinvent himself in every new city he visited. Child protection services as we know them today didn't exist. Children were often seen as economic assets rather than individuals needing protection. They worked, they traveled alone, they interacted with strangers as a normal part of daily life. And perhaps most significantly, there was no concept of serial killer in the public consciousness. People understood that murders happened, but the idea that someone might systematically hunt and kill strangers over a period of years, that was beyond most people's imagination. Albert Fish operated in this gap between a public that couldn't conceive of what he was and a law enforcement system that couldn't track him, even if they suspected. This context doesn't excuse his crimes, but it helps us understand how he was able to operate for so long. And it reminds us that the child protection systems we have today, flawed as they are, exist largely because of cases like this one. July 11th, 1924, Farmingdale, New York. 8-year-old Francis McDonald was playing on the porch of his family's home when a stranger approached and asked to speak with him. Before we go further, I want us to remember Francis not as a victim, but as a child. He loved baseball. His mother later said he had a laugh that could fill their whole house. He wanted to be a firefighter when he grew up. He had just learned to whistle, and he was so proud of it that he whistled constantly, driving his siblings crazy in the way only a little brother could. He was 8 years old, and his whole life was ahead of him. Neighbors later described the man who approached Francis as elderly, thin, with gray hair and a mustache. He seemed harmless, grandfatherly even. 20 minutes later, Francis McDonald was found dead in nearby woods, his body showing signs of severe torture and sexual assault. This was Albert Fish's first known murder, though investigators would later suspect he had been killing for years before Francis McDonald. What made this case significant wasn't just the brutality of the crime, but what Fish did afterward. Fish didn't flee the area immediately after killing Francis. Instead, he remained in Farmingdale for several days, visiting local businesses, chatting with residents, even expressing sympathy to the McDonald family about their loss. He was studying the impact of his crime. He wanted to see how a community reacted to the murder of a child, how parents changed their behavior, how fear spread through a neighborhood. Albert Fish was conducting research for future crimes. 4 years later, Fish struck again. Billy Gaffney was 4 years old, barely more than a baby. He had blonde curls and blue eyes. He loved his toy train set. His mother said he was afraid of the dark, so she always left a candle burning in his room at night. On February 11th, 1927, Billy was playing with a friend near his apartment building in Brooklyn when he vanished. Witnesses saw an elderly man talking to the children shortly before Billy disappeared. Billy's body was never found, but years later, Albert Fish would confess to his murder in graphic detail. More importantly, he would describe what he did to Billy's family in the weeks following the disappearance. He would follow family members as they searched for Billy, watching their desperation, feeding off their hope and despair. For Albert Fish, the murder of Billy Gaffney wasn't a single crime. It was an ongoing campaign of psychological torture that lasted for months. This pattern reveals something crucial about Fish's intent. He wasn't just a killer. He was a collector of suffering. Each crime provided him with multiple victims, the child who died, and the family members who would spend the rest of their lives being tortured by their memories and his ongoing psychological warfare. But Albert Fish wasn't finished perfecting his methods. The McDonnell and Gaffney murders had taught him valuable lessons about how to maximize the impact of his crimes. Now he was ready to commit the act that would make him infamous, the murder that would demonstrate his complete mastery of psychological torture. The murder of Grace Budd. May 25, 1928. The classified section of the New York World newspaper contained a simple advertisement. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. Edward Budd was looking for work to help support his struggling family during the Great Depression. What he found instead was Albert Fish, who had been scanning newspapers specifically for ads placed by young people seeking employment. Fish, calling himself Frank Howard, responded to Edward's ad by mail, claiming to be a wealthy farmer from Long Island who needed help with his property. He arranged to meet the Budd family at their Manhattan apartment to discuss employment opportunities. On June 3, 1928, a well-dressed elderly man arrived at the Budd family's apartment. He was charming, polite, and generous. He brought fresh cheese from his farm and even gave the family money as an advance on Edward's future wages. To the Budds, Frank Howard seemed like an answer to their prayers. But Albert Fish had no intention of hiring Edward Budd. He was there for a different purpose entirely. During his visit, Fish met Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace Budd. Grace Budd. Let's take a moment to remember who she really was. Grace loved to dance. Her family said she would spin around the apartment, making up songs, pretending she was performing on a grand stage. She was kind to her younger siblings, often sharing her small portions of food when the family didn't have enough. She loved school, especially reading. Her teachers said she had just started reading fairy tales and couldn't get enough of them. Stories about princesses and happy endings and good triumphing over evil. She dreamed of becoming a nurse someday. She would bandage her dolls and her siblings' scraped knees with such serious concentration that her mother would laugh and call her Nurse Grace. She was 10 years old. She wore a white dress on June 3rd, 1928, because it was her favorite. She was excited because a kind man was taking her to a birthday party. Grace was a real person, a child with dreams and hopes and a future that should have happened. I want us to hold on to that. Not the way she died, but the way she lived, and the life she would have had. Fish spent several hours with the Budd family, studying their dynamics, their financial desperation, their trust in his fake persona. He was particularly attentive to Grace, asking her about her interests, her favorite foods, her dreams for the future. To the Budds, his interest in Grace seemed grandfatherly. In reality, Albert Fish was selecting his next victim. When Fish left that day, he promised to return the following week to take Edward to his farm. But when he came back on June 3rd, he had a different proposal. Fish told the family that he had been invited to his niece's birthday party in the Bronx, and he wondered if Grace would like to come along. There would be other children there, he said, and games and cake. It would be a wonderful day for a little girl who rarely had such opportunities. The Budd family was hesitant. They had only just met Mr. Howard, after all, but he had already proven himself trustworthy and generous. Edward would start his new job the following week, which meant the family's financial problems would soon be solved. Most importantly, Grace herself desperately wanted to go. She had put on her best white dress and was practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of a party. As a mother, I can't imagine how the Budds must have felt in that moment. They wanted to give their daughter a chance at happiness, but something must have felt wrong. Parents develop instincts about these things, subtle warnings that we can't always articulate. But Albert Fish was a master manipulator. He had spent decades perfecting his ability to appear harmless, trustworthy, even beneficial, and the Budds' desperation worked in his favor. People who are struggling financially often can't afford to turn down opportunities, even when those opportunities feel risky. Albert Fish understood this. He had specifically targeted a family in financial distress, because he knew they would be more likely to take chances than they might otherwise avoid. At 2 p.m. on June 3, 1928, Grace Budd left her family's apartment holding the hand of a man who called himself Frank Howard. She was never seen alive again. The selection of Grace Budd reveals the sophistication of Albert Fish's criminal intent. This wasn't random. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological operation. Fish had spent weeks, possibly months, scanning newspaper advertisements for the perfect setup. He wasn't just looking for victims. He was looking for families that met specific criteria: financial desperation, multiple children, parents who would be susceptible to manipulation. When he found Edward Budd's employment ad, Fish saw an opportunity to access an entire family unit, but his intent went far beyond simple murder. Studies of predatory behavior show that the most dangerous offenders are those who engage in extensive planning and victim selection. Fish demonstrated both. He created an entire false identity, complete with backstory and props. He made multiple visits to establish trust. He identified the family's vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. But what makes Fish's case especially disturbing is the psychological dimension of his planning. He wasn't just planning a murder. He was engineering a scenario that would maximize the family's guilt and self-blame. By positioning himself as a benefactor, someone who was going to solve their financial problems, he ensured that when Grace disappeared, the family would torture themselves with guilt. They had trusted him. They had handed their daughter over to him. Fish knew they would spend the rest of their lives asking themselves, how could we have been so stupid? That's psychological torture that extends for decades. Fish could have killed Grace Budd and disappeared. Instead, he chose a method that would maximize the psychological torture of everyone involved. His true intent was to create a story, a detailed, horrific narrative that would live in the Budd family's minds forever. He didn't just want to kill Grace. He wanted to make sure her parents knew exactly how she died, exactly what she experienced, exactly how much she suffered. And he wanted them to know that their trust, their desperation, their love for their daughter had made it all possible. This is what separates Albert Fish from other serial killers. Most murderers try to distance themselves from their crimes, to minimize their connection to the victims. Fish did the opposite. He wanted to be intimately connected to his victims' families forever. He wanted to become the voice in their heads they could never silence, the nightmare that would visit them every time they closed their eyes, the shadow that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Albert Fish wasn't just committing murder. He was committing psychological genocide, systematically destroying every bit of peace, trust, and hope that his victims' families had ever possessed. Let's look at the timeline of the Grace Budd investigation, because understanding how long this family suffered gives us a sense of Fish's calculated cruelty. June 3, 1928, Grace Budd disappears. June 4th through 10th, 1928, intensive search by NYPD. Hundreds of tips investigated. June 1928 to 1934, 6 years of uncertainty, hope, and despair for the Budd family. November 1934, the letter arrives. 6 years, 5 months after Grace's disappearance. December 13th, 1934, Albert Fish arrested. 6 years, 6 months after the murder. That's 2,385 days that the Budd family lived in agony. Over 6 years of wondering if their daughter was alive somewhere, if she was suffering, if she would come home. And Albert Fish knew this. He waited deliberately. He let them hope. He let them imagine scenarios where Grace was still alive. And then, when he finally told them the truth, he made it as horrific as possible. This wasn't impulsive. This was a 6-year-long torture campaign against a single family. For 6 years, the Budd family lived in agony. Grace's disappearance had been investigated by police, but with no body and no substantial leads, the case went cold. The family never stopped hoping she might return, never stopped imagining scenarios where their daughter was still alive somewhere. Albert Fish knew this, and in November 1934, he decided it was time to take their hope away from them forever. The letter that arrived at the Budd family's apartment was written in neat, careful handwriting. It was addressed to Grace's mother, Delia Budd, and it contained the most detailed, sadistic confession in the history of American crime. I'm not going to read Fish's letter in full. The complete text is too disturbing to broadcast, and frankly, reproducing it would accomplish exactly what Fish intended, spreading his psychological poison to more victims. But I will tell you what the letter contained, because understanding Fish's intent requires understanding the calculated cruelty of his final communication with the Budd family. The letter began with Fish describing how he had killed and eaten Grace Budd, but it wasn't a simple confession. It was a detailed, step-by-step account of every moment of Grace's final day, written specifically to maximize her parents' suffering. Fish described Grace's excitement about the party, her trust in Frank Howard, her confusion when he took her to an abandoned house instead of a birthday celebration. He wrote about her fear when she realized something was wrong, her desperate attempts to escape, her pleas for her parents. The letter was designed to destroy any possibility that the Budd family could ever find peace. Fish wanted to make sure that every time they remembered Grace, they would also remember his words. He was inserting himself permanently into their memories of their daughter. But Fish made one crucial mistake. In his eagerness to maximize the psychological impact of his letter, he included too many specific details that could be traced back to him. The letter mentioned the abandoned house where Grace had died. It referenced specific locations and time frames. Most importantly, it was written on stationery that could be traced to a specific boarding house where Fish had been living. Detective William King of the New York Police Department spent weeks following the clues in Fish's letter, and on December 13, 1934, he knocked on the door of Albert Fish's room at 200 East 52nd Street. Detective William King's pursuit of Albert Fish demonstrates the kind of old-fashioned police work that solved cases before modern forensics. King was a 20-year veteran of the NYPD, and the Budd case had haunted him for 6 years. When the letter arrived, King recognized it for what it was, both a confession and a clue. Fish's arrogance had made him sloppy. The stationery bore a small emblem from a private chauffeurs' benevolent association. King traced this emblem to a specific organization, then identified members who had stayed at boarding houses near where the stationery was distributed. It took weeks of legwork, knocking on doors, interviewing landlords, checking registration logs at dozens of boarding houses throughout New York City. When King finally found Fish's boarding house, he staked it out for 3 days, waiting for Fish to return. He didn't want to risk losing his suspect by raiding an empty room. On December 13th, Fish returned to collect a check that was being held for him. King approached him in the boarding house hallway. According to King's later testimony, Fish didn't try to run. He didn't deny his identity. Instead, he smiled and said, "I've been expecting you." Fish didn't try to escape or deny his crimes. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally be caught. He had spent decades perfecting his ability to cause suffering, and now he was ready to share his expertise with the world. Albert Fish wanted to tell his story, and he wanted everyone to know exactly what kind of monster had been living among them. Albert Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York. It should have been a straightforward case. Fish had confessed to Grace Budd's murder in his own handwriting, and investigators had uncovered evidence linking him to multiple other crimes. But Albert Fish had one final opportunity to terrorize the public, and he intended to make the most of it. Fish's defense team planned to argue that their client was legally insane, so mentally disturbed that he couldn't be held responsible for his crimes. To support this argument, they needed to present evidence of Fish's psychological condition. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. During psychiatric evaluation, Fish confessed to killing at least 15 children over a period of more than 20 years. He described his crimes in such graphic detail that several examining psychiatrists had to excuse themselves from the sessions. But Fish didn't just confess. He seemed to relive each murder as he described it, displaying a level of excitement and satisfaction that horrified even experienced mental health professionals. Fish told psychiatrists about his elaborate fantasies involving cannibalism, torture, and human sacrifice. He described religious visions that commanded him to commit acts of violence. He demonstrated the needles he had inserted into his own body, some of which had been there for years. X-rays taken during Fish's medical examination revealed 27 needles embedded in his pelvic region alone. His body was a roadmap of self-inflicted wounds, burns, and scars accumulated over decades of systematic self-torture. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't Fish's capacity for self-harm. It was his detailed knowledge of his victims' families. He had kept careful records of each family's response to their child's disappearance, their search efforts, their ongoing grief. Fish had been collecting souvenirs, but not physical objects. He had been collecting suffering. The psychiatric testimony at Fish's trial presented a complex picture. While Fish clearly exhibited severe psychological disturbances, the evaluating psychiatrists were divided on whether he met the legal definition of insanity. Some argued that his elaborate religious delusions and obvious mental illness made him incapable of understanding right from wrong. Others pointed out that Fish's careful planning, his ability to maintain a normal facade for decades, and his systematic concealment of his crimes all demonstrated that he understood exactly what he was doing. The key question wasn't whether Fish was mentally ill. Clearly he was. The question was whether his mental illness prevented him from understanding that his actions were wrong. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Walter Ferris, argued that Fish's elaborate planning and careful concealment of his crimes proved he was legally sane. A truly insane person, Ferris argued, wouldn't be capable of the sophisticated deception Fish had maintained for decades. The jury agreed. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, they found Albert Fish guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death in the electric chair. But Fish's reaction to his death sentence revealed the final, most disturbing aspect of his psychological profile. Albert Fish was excited about his execution. He told reporters that being electrocuted would be the supreme thrill, the ultimate experience of pain that he had been seeking his entire life. Even facing death, Fish was still trying to turn his punishment into another opportunity for satisfaction. He was still trying to win, even in defeat. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed at Sing Sing Prison. Witnesses reported that when the first electrical charge was applied, the equipment malfunctioned, possibly due to the metal needles embedded throughout Fish's body. He had managed to complicate his own execution, extending his suffering just a few moments longer. As we conclude our examination of Albert Fish, we need to confront the most disturbing question his case raises. What was his ultimate intent? We've established that Fish wasn't just a killer. He was a psychological terrorist who used murder as a tool to create ongoing suffering. But why? What did he hope to accomplish? Based on his letters, his confessions, and his behavior during trial, Albert Fish's intent appears to have been the complete corruption of human trust and innocence. Fish specifically targeted children because they represent everything good and hopeful in human nature. Trust, curiosity, faith in adults to protect them. By destroying children, Fish was attacking the very foundation of human society. But he didn't stop with the children themselves. Fish's elaborate psychological torture of victims' families was designed to destroy their capacity for trust, hope, and love. He wanted to make parents afraid of every stranger, suspicious of every kindness, tortured by every memory of their lost child. Fish's intent was to spread contamination, to infect as many people as possible with his own twisted worldview. The letters he sent to families weren't just confessions. They were attempts to spread his psychological poison. Fish was trying to create more people like himself, people whose capacity for trust and love had been systematically destroyed. In a very real sense, Albert Fish was trying to make the world in his own image, a place where children aren't safe, where parents can't protect their families, where kindness is always a mask for cruelty. This explains why he was so willing to confess, so eager to share details of his crimes during trial. Fish wanted his story told because he believed his story would damage everyone who heard it. And perhaps most disturbing of all, he may have been right. The Albert Fish case fundamentally changed how Americans thought about child safety. Parents became more suspicious, more protective, more afraid. The image of the kindly stranger offering candy or assistance became permanently associated with danger. Fish succeeded in injecting his paranoia into American culture, where it remains to this day. Every parent who warns their child about stranger danger is, in some small way, still responding to Albert Fish's legacy. He became the boogeyman he always wanted to be. A figure whose influence extends far beyond his actual crimes, whose psychological impact continues to shape how we think about safety, trust, and human nature. Albert Fish died in 1936, but his intent to corrupt human innocence and spread fear is still being fulfilled nearly a century later. Before we close, I want to address some common misconceptions about the Albert Fish case and what it means for child safety today. Myth number 1. Strangers are the primary threat to children. Reality. While Fish was a stranger to his victims, statistically, children are far more likely to be harmed by someone they know. A family member, family friend, coach, or teacher. According to the Department of Justice, about 90% of child sexual abuse is committed by someone the child knows and trusts. The stranger danger narrative that Fish helped create has actually made children less safe by focusing attention away from the most common perpetrators. We need to teach children about appropriate boundaries with all adults, not just strangers. Myth number 2. You can identify dangerous people by how they look or act. Reality. Fish appeared grandfatherly, well-dressed, polite, and trustworthy. Research on criminal behavior consistently shows that predators are often skilled at appearing normal and trustworthy. They have to be in order to gain access to victims. What matters isn't teaching children to identify suspicious people based on appearance, but teaching them about appropriate boundaries, consent, and ensuring they can report uncomfortable situations without fear of punishment. Myth number 3. Cases like Fish's are common. Reality. Serial killers, especially those targeting children, are extremely rare. The statistical risk has not increased. If anything, violent crimes against children has decreased since Fish's era. What has increased is our awareness of our reporting systems. According to FBI statistics, there are typically fewer than 50 active serial killers in the United States at any given time. In a population of over 330 million people, the risk of your child being victimized by a serial killer is extraordinarily low. The real lessons from the Fish case aren't about stranger danger. They're about the importance of community awareness and connection, systems that allow children to report abuse safely, understanding that predators often appear trustworthy, recognizing that isolation and desperation make families vulnerable, building protective networks rather than just teaching fear. The Fish case is important to study, but not because it represents a common threat. It's important because it shows us the extreme end of the spectrum. What happens when multiple risk factors align and when predatory behavior goes unchecked. But we have to be careful not to let extreme cases create disproportionate fear. The question we should be asking isn't, how do we protect children from the next Albert Fish? It's, what systems can we build that prevent predatory behavior and catch it early when it does occur? Since Fish's era, we've made significant progress. Today we have mandatory reporting laws in all 50 states requiring teachers, doctors, counselors, and other professionals to report suspected abuse. These systems didn't exist in Fish's time. Organizations that work with children conduct criminal background checks on employees and volunteers. This creates barriers for convicted offenders trying to access children through institutional settings. Sex offenders have to register. While these registries have limitations and controversies, they provide some information about convicted offenders living in communities. We have improved investigation techniques, DNA evidence, digital forensics, national criminal databases, and improved interjurisdictional cooperation, all tools that would have caught Fish much earlier if they had existed. We have better education. Modern child safety education focuses on bodily autonomy, consent, and helping children understand what appropriate adult behavior looks like. We teach children that they have a right to say no to uncomfortable touch, even from trusted adults. So what can parents actually do? Here are evidence-based recommendations. First, know who is in your child's life, not because everyone is dangerous, but because awareness is protective. Know your children's teachers, coaches, friends' parents. Be present and engaged. Second, teach your children accurate names for body parts and age-appropriate information about privacy and boundaries. This gives them language to report inappropriate behavior if it occurs. Third, create an environment where children feel comfortable reporting uncomfortable situations without shame or blame. Many children don't report abuse because they fear they'll get in trouble or won't be believed. Fourth, be aware of isolation. Predators often try to isolate children from their support systems or create situations where they can be alone with a child. Pay attention if someone is creating opportunities to be alone with your child or trying to establish a special relationship that excludes parents. Fifth, trust your instincts, but verify them. If something feels wrong, investigate, but don't let fear override reason. Most people are not predators, and most situations are innocent. Sixth, support community-level protective systems. Advocate for well-funded child protection services, school counselors, mental health resources, and programs that support vulnerable families. But here's what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't teach our children that the world is full of predators. We shouldn't make them afraid of kindness or community or trusting appropriate adults. Because the truth is, most people are good. Most communities are safe. And children who grow up afraid of everyone are actually more vulnerable, not less. They're less likely to ask for help when they need it, less likely to develop the social skills that actually keep them safe, more likely to be isolated. Research shows that children who have strong connections to multiple trusted adults, who understand boundaries and consent, and who know they can report problems without punishment are the safest children. Albert Fish wanted us to be afraid. He wanted his legacy to be a world where no one trusts anyone. We don't have to give him that victory. Before we close, I want to take a moment to honor the victims, not as names in a case file, but as the people they were. Francis McDonald, who loved baseball and wanted to be a firefighter, who had a laugh that filled his house, who had just learned to whistle and was so proud of it. Billy Gaffney, who was afraid of the dark and loved his toy trains, who had blonde curls and blue eyes, who needed a candle burning in his room at night to feel safe. Grace Budd, who dreamed of becoming a nurse and loved to dance, who shared her food with her siblings even when the family had little, who loved fairy tales about princesses and happy endings. And the other children, many whose names we'll never know, who had dreams and families and futures that Albert Fish took from them. Their lives mattered. Their deaths were tragedies. But they were more than just victims of a monster. They were children who laughed and played and had people who loved them. The best way to honor their memory isn't to let their stories be defined by how they died. It's to remember that they lived, that they mattered, and that their loss created holes in families and communities that never fully healed. And it's to commit ourselves to creating a world where fewer families have to experience that kind of loss. The Albert Fish case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of innocence. Fish succeeded in ways that go far beyond his individual crimes. He proved that a single person, motivated by the right kind of malicious intent, can damage thousands of lives across multiple generations. Every parent who has ever felt a chill when their child talks to a stranger, every family that has been torn apart by the disappearance of a loved one, every community that has had to grapple with the reality that monsters can hide behind friendly faces. All of these people have been touched by Albert Fish's legacy. But there's another lesson in Fish's story, one that's especially relevant as we approach Halloween. The monsters in our folklore, vampires, werewolves, demons, are frightening because they're powerful and supernatural. But they're also comforting in a way, because they're obviously monsters. You can see them coming. Albert Fish was terrifying precisely because he looked like everyone else. He was a grandfather figure, a churchgoer, a man who brought gifts to children and spoke politely to their parents. The real boogeyman isn't the creature under the bed or the shadow in the closet. It's the person who has learned to weaponize trust itself. Fish's case reminds us that evil isn't always obvious, that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who have perfected the art of appearing harmless. But it also reminds us of the importance of community, of looking out for each other's children, of creating systems that make it harder for predators to operate in isolation. Albert Fish succeeded partly because he found families who were isolated by poverty, desperation, and social circumstances that made them vulnerable to manipulation. The best defense against the next Albert Fish isn't just teaching our children to avoid strangers. It's building communities where no family has to face danger alone. As we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with this thought. Albert Fish wanted us to be afraid. He wanted his story to make us suspicious, paranoid, unable to trust. But the ultimate victory over his legacy isn't fear. It's the continued capacity for appropriate trust, for community connection, for the belief that most people are good and that we can protect each other from those who aren't. Evil exists, but it doesn't have to win. That's the real lesson of Albert Fish. Not that monsters walk among us, but that our capacity for love, protection, and community is stronger than their capacity for destruction. Fish wanted to spread fear and corruption. We can choose instead to spread awareness, compassion, and genuine protection. We can choose to remember his victims, not as statistics, but as beloved children. We can choose to build systems that protect the vulnerable without creating paranoia. We can choose to live in a world where kindness isn't always suspect, where community is valued, where children can be children. That's how we defeat the boogeyman. Not by becoming afraid, but by refusing to let fear define us. Thank you for listening to this episode of Deadly Intent. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, please remember that help is available for anyone struggling with thoughts of violence or harm. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7 at 988. And the National Child Abuse Hotline can be reached at 1-800-4A-CHILD. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends who appreciate thoughtful true crime content. Every review helps other listeners find us. Until next time, remember, the scariest monsters are the ones who choose to become monsters, and that means we can choose to stop them. Together, through awareness, community, and genuine protection. I'm Carmen Carrion. Stay safe out there and have a safe and fun spooky season. Hey, thanks for sticking around. I wanted to add something personal here. This episode was genuinely difficult to produce. There were moments during research where I had to step away, take a break, and remind myself that this work actually does matter. If you're a parent listening to this and you're feeling anxious right now, I get it. I felt it too while writing this. But here's what I want you to remember. The world isn't full of Albert Fishes. Cases like this are extraordinarily rare. Your children are statistically very safe, especially if you're engaged, aware, and connected to your community. Don't let this story steal your peace. Let it inform your awareness, but not your fear. And if you're someone who experienced childhood trauma or abuse, I see you. Your pain is valid. And unlike Albert Fish, most survivors don't become predators. Most survivors become protectors. Most survivors break the cycle. That's the story that doesn't get told enough. That's the story that actually defeats the boogeyman. All right, that's all. Take care of yourselves and each other.